Okay. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. My name is Zia Ahmad. I'm the moderator or the MC for this MEFF webinar. And we are going to start the program very soon. Now, in order to start it formally, we would recite the Al-Fatiha, the opening chapter of the Holy Quran. And I'll just recite it with you. And if you want to say Ameen at the end, that would be great. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, Maliki Yawmiddin, Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'een, Ihdina as-sirata al-mustaqim, sirata al-lazina an'amta alayhim, ghayri al-maghdubi alayhim, walad-dallin. Ameen. I wish to welcome all the participants to this webinar of MEFF and also the speakers today. And I just want to go through the program for this webinar. This is a welcome by myself, and I will also introduce this theme. And then our first speaker will be Professor Greg Barton, and he will do his presentation. Our second speaker is Dr. Haroon Kasim. And our third speaker was Rita Jabri Markwell. Unfortunately, there was a family emergency and she's not going to take part. And our fourth speaker is Dr. Adil Khan. And after that, we are going to have some wrap up as well as some questions and answers. One change as well that after Professor Barton's talk, we are going to have a question and answer session with him since he has to leave a bit early as well. So if you want to pose any questions specifically for him, please do so now. Or during his talk, and he will answer those questions just soon after his talk. Now, if you want to ask any questions, you can write it into the Q&A sheet or not in the chat, and then I'll pose those questions and get the speakers to answer those. Just to introduce myself, my name is Zia Ahmad. I'm the member of MEFF from the very beginning, which is about 36 years ago. And I'm currently also the public officer and the trustee of MEFF as well. And my main hat at the moment is the editor-in-chief of the Australasian Muslim Times, currently, which I run. Now, MEFF, as you already know, stands for a Multicultural East Festival and Fair. It's being organized by the Australian MEFF Consortium. MEFF is actually the first and the largest and the longest running Eid festival in Australia. We introduced the idea of a multicultural Eid festival in Australia. Basically, the idea of a village fair from India, and we sort of imported it to Australia and Australianized it and Islamized it. At one time, it used to attract up to about 30,000 people. But since many festivals started now, we have come down to around about 20,000. It has very much been a multicultural festival, inviting people from various ethnic communities as well as from other people from other faith communities. It has a long success story. As part of the festival, we also hold a formal reception where we invite community leaders and political leaders, where we set up a theme for various people and speakers to speak on. So since last year, because of COVID, it's the first time in this 36 years history that we have to cancel it. And unfortunately, this year we thought that we'll hold it, but a couple of months ago we had to cancel it again this year because of the risky situation. And now we feel that I think we did the right thing. So this is the second webinar, and hopefully we don't have to conduct a webinar next year. We are planning for the real festival next year. So that's about MEFF. Now, just to brief you a little bit about the theme that I think the speakers will be talking about it. Just because of the time, I just want to give a bit of a rationale about the theme. And this theme has been chosen to highlight the concerns on the effect of hate speech leading to violent behavior in our community, and review various efforts being made by activists, NGOs, legal professionals, academics, government authorities in countering this locally as well as globally. The context of this webinar is the Christchurch massacre in March 2019, which white supremacists have surged in Australia, US and Europe, we feel. And also we've also found Hindutva extremism in India and general inter-community disharmony as well, and especially in the Muslim countries as well. And before these new phenomena, we also want to acknowledge the issues with the Muslim extremism, which led to terrorism, whatever the reasons have been. And so we need to look at these in a wholesome way and see what, as a civil society, we can do at various levels to counter disharmony in the society. So with this, I just want to invite the first speaker, Professor Greg Barton. I just want to introduce him first. Now he is a professor at the Alfred Deakin Institute for Citizenship and Globalization at Deakin University in Melbourne, and we have produced his articles in AMUST as well. And Greg is one of Australia's leading scholars of both modern Indonesia and of terrorism and countering violent extremism. For more than 25 years, he has undertaken extensive research on Indonesian politics and society, especially the role of Islam as both a constructive and a disruptive force. He has been active in the interfaith dialogues initiatives and has a deep commitment to building understanding of Islam and Muslim society. Greg also has a general interest in security studies and human security, and a particular interest in countering violent extremism. He continues to research the offshoots of Jamaat Islamiyah and related radical Islamic movements in Southeast Asia. He has been on ABC TV, Sky News Australia, ABC National, ABC Radio, Radio International, BBC Radio, and various different media channels. With this introduction, I would like to invite Professor Greg Barton to do his presentation. Thank you, Greg. Greg, I think you are muted. Please unmute yourself, Greg.
Apologies. It's by this time I should have learned how to do Zoom, but obviously not. Salam alaikum. Thank you very much for inviting me to participate. It's a pleasure and an honor. And I know it's a little late to say Eid Mubarak, but best wishes. Thank you for including me in this Eid webinar. Let's hope next year we have a face-to-face Eid, and best wishes for that. I'm going to try and frame some of the issues that Brother Zia was talking about. I don't think I can tell you too much which you don't already know. That's perhaps not important. What's important is to help us frame things and think of how we understand the issues we're dealing with. So apologies in advance if this is a little heavy on slides and overly technical. The slides can be shared. I'm very happy for you to share them, and I'll go through them quickly, and happy to take some questions immediately afterwards. So, of course, we know too well the tragedy of Christchurch. It was not a tragedy simply an accident. It was an act of terror. It was an act of hate. it was of the scale it was because of the use of a military-style assault weapon, but I want to focus on this question of hate. An Australian terrorist killing 51, injuring 40 others. It's on the one hand too awful to think about. On the other hand, we have to think about it because I don't think this is a one-off incident. It's part of a larger pattern. So some of the lessons from thinking about Christchurch is it's forced us to recognise that in Australia, because this was an Australian terrorist, far-right extremism is not something that might happen in the future and result in terrorism. It's already happened. We also see a link, as we see with the Christchurch Royal Commission report, a link between hate crime, hate speech, and terror. And I'll unpack that a little bit. We know that these sort of incidents, maybe one single actor, a so-called lone actor. I prefer the term lone actor to lone wolf because there's nothing glorious about such terrorists. But they are always part of an online, if not physical community. It's always part of a social thing. And that's something we need to understand with all kinds of extremism, including violent extremism. And of course, if it could happen in Christchurch, which is one of the most lovely and peaceful cities on the planet, it could happen anywhere. So I know there's a sober message. We have to try and understand how it happened there and try and prevent it happening elsewhere. It has happened in the past. What happened in Christchurch was very much modelled on what happened in Norway almost 10 years ago. One terrorist, again, that time killing 77, many other copycats since. He was a loner, but he posted a 1,000-page manifesto because he was desperate for his online community to understand what he was doing and applaud him, and indeed they did. We saw after Christchurch an attack in El Paso. Actually, there are many attacks. I'm just highlighting a couple of prominent examples. All of these things feature the theme that we saw in the manifesto posted in Norway, and then again in Christchurch, a shorter manifesto about a great replacement. In this case, about white, sort of nominally Christian, nominally Europeans being replaced by others. In the past, it was being replaced by Jews. It's still Jews. Now it's Muslims. It's Asians. It's people of color. It's bigoted and distasteful, racist, but it's also systematic. It's not just individuals having bad feelings. It's part of a belief system that we need to understand. So this great replacement thesis is important to get our heads around. It drives right-wing extremism. Of course, it's been a much more serious problem in America than elsewhere. It's a serious problem in Europe and a less serious problem in Australia, but Christchurch reminds us it's come here. And we live in a global community, so these things are connected. Most of the terrorist attacks in America today are far-right terror attacks. That's just the reality. It's not just being politically correct to make this point. It's just an objective reality. And we've recently heard ASIO say that 4 years ago, something like 15% of the counterterrorism caseload was far-right extremism. And then last year, they told us it was 40%. And just recently, the Director General, Mike Burgess, has said it's coming up towards 50%. So that's really sobering. And that's with other kinds of terrorism also increasing. So, we're coming up to 20 years on from the 9/11 attacks. And I think a lot of people are thinking wishfully that we're moving beyond terrorism, but that's not the truth. We have to deal with these realities. The far right is certainly a rising problem. It is very much bound up with an agenda of hate. There's no question about that. Two of the best research groups in America to follow, and in the world indeed, are the Southern Poverty Law Center and the Anti-Defamation League. So far-right extremism is now the #1 terror threat in the US. That may also be the case in Europe. It's not yet the case in Australia, but it's coming up towards that point. Of course, the concern we have is with lone actors, but we saw with Christchurch, a lone actor can cause immense damage. So we can't underestimate that. I wrote earlier in the year, quoting Tim Sopomasam, who referred to a pyramid of hate crime. He said the history of hate and racism tells us that any kind of violence cannot be separated from banal or low levels of prejudice and discrimination. Hate speech leads to political violence if you allow it to escalate. Now, I'm not saying that hate speech always leads to violence. Of course it doesn't, thankfully. Hate speech is a problem in itself, particularly when it's reflecting a systemic belief system and a social network. Whether or not it leads to violence, it's a problem, and it does cause harm. Words do harm. but it also is an indicator sometimes of where physical violence could be coming. And that's the case with the Christchurch terrorist. It's so often the case. We should pay attention. So I've, along with colleagues at Deakin, suggested we could start to think about it in terms of not just violent extremism, but violent and hateful extremism, recognizing that hateful extremism is not always violent extremism, although violent extremism almost always involves hate. So there is that element. We're not saying that strong belief systems and convictions are in themselves a problem. People need to have belief systems, and they can be quite strong and strange from our point of view. That's a matter of personal freedom. They should be allowed to believe what they wish, so long as it doesn't actively promote hatred and intolerance and sort of demonizing, otherizing. And if we understand this problem in terms of not just violent extremism, but hateful extremism, we can, I think, frame the problem more broadly and think of solutions more broadly. I know that the Muslim community in Australia has long felt that it's been made a kind of victim. It is a victim of all sorts of things, including terrorist recruiters, but it's made a victim in being blamed for the problem of terrorism that is done in the name of Islam. It's very unfair. If we come together and work on hate as well as violence, I think it's easier to form a common consensus and be involved in making society better, rather than just taking a securitizing approach, which makes people feel like they're being blamed and made into some sort of other that's at fault for what's happening. As I said, I'm not suggesting that hateful extremism always leads to violence. Of course it doesn't. But we've seen before with misogyny, sexist narratives, with racism, that these things are problems in themselves, and they can manifest on a larger scale. It's interesting, after my colleagues and I began thinking about this at Deakin in October of 2019, 18 months ago, the Commission for Countering Extremism in England and Wales came out with a report. It's online and you might like to look at it. There's a brief executive summary. They spoke of challenging hateful extremism, and they defined it in these ways. I think it's not a bad definition. They're talking about behavior. So speech is a behavior that can incite and amplify hate or evoke hatred or justify it. And it's often associated with white supremacist beliefs, but as I'll say in a minute, it's not just white supremacist, unfortunately. So hateful extremism, to be clear, is talking about a shared radical belief system. So it's not just individuals having hate, which is a common human problem, but it's a shared system that's put in some sort of framework. And so the core narrative is very much about the world being us, the good people, and them, the bad people, defined by religion, by skin color, by whatever. Violent extremism almost always involves this kind of hateful extremism, but of course hateful extremism often remains at the level of words and not physical action. And this is quite different from just talking about regular hate crimes. I think we need to pay attention to hate crime or hate incidents, because it's very hard to meet the threshold definition of crime. But some of those hate incidents and crimes are just individuals behaving badly because of, poor education, understanding, bad behavior, blaming others, taking out that hatred on individuals. What we're talking about here, it goes beyond sort of pedestrian hate and malice into a more systemic belief system. Terrorism, violent extremism was always social, even if an individual acts alone, as I said earlier. That was the case with Christchurch. And so too, if somebody's involved in racism, Islamophobia, bigotry, sexism, etc., as part of a group, it becomes even more dangerous, and we need to recognize that. And I'll give you some examples just to sort of illustrate what I'm saying. It might seem odd to mention the Ku Klux Klan, but as a church-going Christian, I have to acknowledge that Christianity is often hijacked for bad purposes. Not enough time to discuss all of those bad purposes, but you know what I'm talking about. We saw it during the Trump presidency, very sadly, I must say. But the Ku Klux Klan very clearly has a link with it tries to represent itself as channeling Christianity, even though we know that most Christians will say it's got nothing to do with them. But of course, you know what it's like to say that most Muslims find Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, completely horrible, but people are quick to link those terrorist groups with Muslims and Islam. I think as Christians, it would seem strange to make the link with Ku Klux Klan, but the historical record is pretty clear. And we're dealing here with a kind of system of belief that involves hateful ideas that are often framed in nationalist terms, toxic nationalism, if you like. So white supremacism is one example of that, of toxic nationalism. And there's no getting away from the fact that white supremacism is a big problem around the world, including in Australia, if not in the most extreme forms, in milder forms. Racism, including Islamophobia, are big problems. But it also, as Brother Zia touched on, Hindutva extremism is one manifestation of this. It's a toxic Buddhist nationalism in Myanmar, targeting Rohingya Muslims. So it's we sort of recognize this quite quickly, I think, when we stop to think about it. The Indian case is all too familiar. It's got worse during this COVID pandemic, sadly. I'm not saying everyone who joins RSS, for example, is a full-blown violent extremist, but they are slipping into a system that's very dangerous. And in the case of Myanmar, it literally has resulted in mass suffering and loss of life. It's very much the same sort of phenomenon as white supremacism. It's another kind of toxic identity politics or toxic nationalism, if you like. In this case, a bad expression of Myanmar or Burmese nationalism, of which there are good expressions, but this is a toxic nationalism expression. In Indonesia, the recently banned group, the Islamic Defenders Front, which despite its name is not really doing that at all, is another example of a kind of organized system of hate. Not a violent group by and large, but certainly a problem in terms of hate. But that group also has examples of members who've gone beyond it and joined violent extremist groups. The Royal Commission report coming out of the Christchurch terror attack has made a number of really good concrete suggestions. I'm sure you're familiar, but if not, you can download the reports, and it's a very good summary. I think our other speakers, Dr. Haroon and Dr. Adil, will be speaking about some of these things. I know that Rita would, if she was here. One of the things it recommends very specifically is better legislation on hate speech and hate crime. Hate speech is not the same as hate crime, meaning a criminal threshold is very difficult, but it's interesting that they've framed it in these terms because that speaks to the desire to cast a wide net. And as I've said, some hate speech is not organized hateful extremism because it's just an individual rather than part of a social group and a system of belief, but it's something we have to pay attention to if we pick up that more extreme problem. And finally, just let me mention my colleagues at Deakin who are doing some work in this space, particularly Dr. Matteo Vagani, and he's put up this website called Tackling Hate. So at tacklingHate.org, tacklingHate.org, you'll find some resources and including some videos and other things that might be useful. This is something we've got to work on together. So I'm glad to have the opportunity to speak today because I look forward to a chance to collaborate further in future on these issues. Well, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Greg, for a very elaborate discussion on the topic and in a very short time. So since I know that you may have to leave soon because of the family issues, I'll just pose some of the questions which have been posted already. Now, the first one is from Kamal Dabusi, and I'll read the question. There are so many questions. I will focus on the area of leadership. Where does the government have a role? Is setting tone, allowing groups to take hold, being a victim of death threats and victimization. Following then Minister Dutton's public comments, I feel that government has abdicated leadership and allowed groups to flourish to appeal to an ideological voter base.
Thank you, Brother Zia. I think that's and thank you, Kamal. That's a really good question. I'll try and keep my answers brief because I know we've got a lot of other things to discuss. Look, I think this is part of the issue, and I think it's why having a public discussion, we have to be patient and be respectful, but we do need to speak out at the same time because we need to try and force all of our leaders, whether they're elected politicians or community leaders or whatever leaders, even informal, to live out their leadership to a higher standard. So we've seen this, for example, in the sporting leagues, that we're focused on racism, we're focused on sexism. Obviously, the job is not finished, but today there is behavior that occurs when we see racism and sexism in sport. It's called out, and not quickly enough and not sufficiently enough, but the standards have shifted. What you could get away with 20 years ago, you can't get away with today, thank heavens. I think that's an example of the fact we can make progress by raising an awareness. Some people might dismiss this as being overly political correct or woke, but we know that it's just about being decent and respectful to each other. We shouldn't mistreat women, even with our words. We shouldn't encourage even the most apparently humorous attempt at racism. We know that it's not just what you mean when you say a word, it's how it's heard by the person it's hurting. And we've heard from our sporting leaders how distressing it is to be called a monkey, for example. It's just horrible, even though the person saying it may feel it's not a big thing to say. And this is also true of our politicians. And there are things that are being said in Parliament today. There were things said on the floor of Senate immediately after the Christchurch massacre that shouldn't be said. So we just got to keep on raising this issue and calling it out and hopefully bringing about a change.
Another quick question. Banaja Khalil, I understand the distinction between hateful extremism versus violent extremism, but aren't expressions of hate damaging to individuals, including children, as well as communities as a whole?
A good question. I very much concur. I agree. I think this is one of the reasons why it can be helpful to focus on hateful extremism alongside violent extremism is that we don't have to establish a link between the two. We know that what we do in tackling hate diminishes the space for recruitment to violent extremism, but that hate is a problem in itself. If we can slowly bring down the number of hate speech incidences in public from elected officials, from other leaders, and in the community in general, if we can encourage police and other agencies to take this more seriously and just change attitudes and what's acceptable behavior in Australia, we'll have a healthier and better society. We need to work on that because hate is a problem in itself.
Thank you. I think we'll take the last question. This question is from Neeraj Nanda from South Asia Times. Professor Barton, how much Hindutva extremism is actually fascism?
That's a really good question, Neeraj, and there isn't time to give you a comprehensive answer. Perhaps Dr. Adil, Dr. Haroon may pick up on this a little bit. But in brief, what we're talking about with fascism, it's a very specific thing that arose in the middle of the 20th century in Europe and then spread beyond, but is very much linked in the European case to white supremacism. So it's what we're talking about. It's a kind of toxic identity politics. And it's no coincidence, there's not time to unpack this, but it's no coincidence that the National Socialists in Germany took the ancient Indian Hindu and Buddhist symbol of the swastika and took it and gave it a new and more awful meaning in the European context, because that National Socialism, fascism, took certain ideas from the subcontinent, which then distorted them. But what we're seeing today with Hindutva extremism is sort of the closing of the circle in some ways. We need to be careful not to be too simplistic and reductionist in saying everything is the same thing. I mean, calling everyone a Nazi is not a helpful way of addressing the problem. But we do need to recognize the slippery slope that ends in National Socialism, in fascism, starts with kind of white supremacist ideas. So what we've seen on the streets of American cities and what we're seeing in the streets of, unfortunately, Australian cities and country towns is a slippery slope that leads to fascism. And that's the case also with Hindutva extremism in India.
Okay, thank you, Professor. We'll move to the next speaker. Now, our next speaker is Dr. Haroon Kasim. Dr. Haroon Kasim is a medical hospitalist, MBBS, MS, and he is based in Sydney. He is the founder of the Humanism Project, THP, and also the founder member of the Australian Indian Muslim Forum, which I and Adil are a member as well. He is part of the leadership of the National Policy and Advocacy Group of the Royal Australasian College of Physicians, which seeks to promote uptake of best practices and facilities of high healthcare, and also is the co-chair of healthcare work stream, Internet of Things Alliance of Australia. Now, Haroon has got a lot of experience in terms of activism, and especially in the last 1.5 years, I've been working with him on THP platform, and he will look into a very comprehensive way of as an activist and into countering hate and extremism, and his experience in this field lately. So, Dr. Haroon Kasim. Dr. Haroon, you are muted. Sorry.
Sorry. No, thank you. Yes, I will not really reintroduce myself. You've done a great job. Thank you for your kind words. So what I might do is today, we will just go through the following agenda. We'll start with unlike Prof. Barton, what we've learned is we've learned in our own through our own life experiences. And so a lot of this talk is about our life experiences and what we learned from the work of people like, Greg Barton and people like Rita Jabri and, Adil Khan, and how we are trying to use that to help ourselves. Because for us, it's more than academic. It's very personal. And so this talk that I'm going to give is around our own life experiences and how we're navigating this venomous atmosphere of hate. So I'll start with understanding radicalization and hate as I understand it. And then we'll move on to how this radicalization in some cases actually gets escalates to genocide and has psychological effects. And then we go back to, why we started as a group and our experience of hate and how we came together. And then our own journey in understanding and dissecting and unpacking this hate and how that informed our activism and what we do now and how you can help, right? So let's start with the first one. So around 2014, I think just before that, WhatsApp came, and around 2018 or thereabouts, when the second election, when Modi's second term was coming, so I had been a member of a lot of my groups where I had a lot of childhood friends, and suddenly before the election in 2019, there was a change in the tone of a lot of people that I knew for a very long time. And I think that's where the slippery slope began, the one that Prof. Barton was referring to. And there was a lot of content that was being pushed through WhatsApp and Facebook, and arguably through government actors to have a very a very clear aim that would hopefully give them some political dividends. And that hate, as people started learning and relating to in some ways, just because of the sheer volume of it, there's suddenly normalization of those hate narratives, right? And everyone, when there's normalization, then you have upvotes and likes, and this again is no different. If you were to go back to the Holocaust era, it has the same pattern. You start with a slippery slope, and then people validate it, normalize it. And then once it's normalized, then suddenly you are the victim. right? And you have an aggressor out there who's a threat to you, who is violence inclined, and you need to deal with. And so that threat construction happened next. And being a part of the minority, I was able to feel that very well. And these are people that were friends with me forever, right? I mean, since my childhood. And then once that threat construction is done, now that particular person, whichever community he belongs to, maybe a Jew or a Muslim, is suddenly not human anymore. He is the other, right? He's stereotyped, he's portrayed in a very threatening way as a monster, and that allows you to go on to the next thing, which is group radicalization. So it's okay now, because he's not human anymore, to do, to not really have your moral compass in the way you deal with him or her, right? And then now there's this competition between various group members on, who's more radical, who does, the badder thing, because you're not dealing with a human anymore, you're dealing with a monster, right? So that's radicalization. And this is something I could see in the past 5 years, right? And what happens then is even more interesting. So this is a different stages of genocide by a gentleman called Greg Stanton. And what we talked about right now is the first 4 things, right? So classification, where you identify someone as the other and you symbolize them. For instance, in India, the Prime Minister once made this famous statement that you can actually identify these people by the clothes they wear. They could have a beard, they could have a cap, so that's symbolization. And once you've done that, these people who wear those clothes are subhuman, because you see they are threatening peace. They're coming after you. And so that goes on to the next thing of organization. So that's very close to what we talked about. So the group radicalization occurs in organization, and that we saw happen from 2019. And then you polarize, right? Now you organize, you polarize, see, you're either with us or you're with them. And once you polarize, then things become easier. So around the Delhi election, there's all of this thing about, Gaddaron ko goli maro in Hindi, which is, they're traitors, shoot them. And you see, if you don't, I'm sorry, you're a traitor yourself. And so that's the polarization. And then you have these slogans that prepare people. And then you have extermination and then denial. So I'll actually go through, these have happened in recent times. We were not going back all the way to in the Holocaust. And these narratives are happening right here in Australia. And so what that does to people in terms of psychological effects is people feel unwelcome and unsafe in the community, right? And if you feel unsafe, you're going to feel there's going to be decreasing feelings of safety and security, psychological distress and lower self-esteem. So you don't know why that's happening to you. And then you're depressed, anxious, and you have other things like post-traumatic disorder. Now going on to our story. So these are the generic things. Our story, just going on from that, psychological effects. When we started the group, this is how most of us felt. So when I say us, most of us have an Indian background, and we are very fiercely proud of our multicultural ethos, you see. So you have in our group, and so you have Hindus, you have Muslims, you have Buddhists, and you have Hindu Tamils and Muslim Tamils and so on and so forth. So if you were to take a train from southern India to the north, all you have to do is sit in the train and you'll find so many different languages, so many different dresses. So we have been a people who have been very fiercely proud of a multicultural ethos. But around this 2019 or 18 time, the hate narrative, the volume of it was just humongous, right? And that made people extremely scared, depressed. And some of us used to go online and say, hey, that's wrong. And they used to they used to get trolled with venom. And so almost every person who's in our group felt exactly like this guy feels. And so we formed our group, the Humanism Project, and we said, we will do this. So we will stop the hate and divisiveness and reclaim who we were, our diversity and inclusiveness. So this was around early 2020. And since 2020, we had further understanding into hate. So, it's been a turbulent year since 2020 to 2021. You had the Delhi pogrom in early 2020. Then you had COVID jihad, where the Muslims were blamed for spreading the coronavirus disease. Then you have the Dalits, who are a part of the Indian community. There's a woman who was raped, and then you had anti-Sikh violence. And what is common to all of these was this, right? It starts with classification. So with the Delhi pogrom, the Muslims were the other, they were traitors, they had to be shot, right? And symbolization, they wear a certain kind of clothes, right? And dehumanization. So once you do that, it is okay to shoot them. And since then, believe it or not, we've had webinars in Australia right here who have gone on to deny that there was a pogrom, right? The COVID jihad was another one where people, the Muslims, as you can see there, you see symbolization right there. You have a man. So this particular figure came in a very prominent Indian media house magazine. So you see a Muslim man wearing the skull cap, and there it says 60% of the cases have been spread by Muslims. This thing, symbolization again, resulted in people being shunned from their businesses. The businesses were they were excommunicated. And then there was one really, really poignant story of a woman who was pregnant, goes into a hospital, is not admitted in the hospital, and she actually dies. Heartbreaking stories. Hathras was another one where the Dalit community underwent the same, symbolization, othering, and dehumanization. This was a case where a woman was brutally raped, and in the end, the victim was blamed, and there was total denial. Same thing with the anti-Sikh violence here in Australia that happened recently. The Sikhs were all of a sudden called terrorists, who were traitors to India, and so on and so forth. And there was violence right here in Sydney, and these things go on till today. The hate narrative occurs here, right here in Australia, till today. So what we are doing is, as activists, what we're trying to do is raise awareness, saying that, and we're working with various human rights organizations and interfaith dialogue, saying that, well, this is happening, and this is not good for us. It does not, align with our ethos of multiculturalism, Australian multiculturalism, and cohesiveness. And we're trying to collect data around what's going on. So you see, and we're working with legal and policy experts. One of our speakers here, Rita Jabri, has done a lot of work in that, and we're working with other policy experts. And using this data, which is the evidence, we go on to politicians and say, hey, we have data on how it affects people and, breaks people, breaks societies, impacts on our social cohesion, and pretty much, undermines who we are as Australians and our Australian values. And that is a conversation that we are having. And we also work with global people through global partnerships in the US, UK, Europe. And all the time we go around in circles, learning lessons, fine-tuning our messaging, fine-tuning our data collection, speaking to politicians. So that's really our advocacy at a high level. And what are we asking them? So the first ask to them is this, it's really easy to stop hate. And how do you do that? You stop funding it. You see, a lot of these organizations which have known connections to extremist organizations overseas are, believe it or not, here in Australia being funded through federal and state funding, right? So there's a complete lack of awareness of what these organizations are and what they represent. And that's sad because, in the era of COVID, you really could put that money to better use. You see what I'm saying? So stop funding, as easy as that. And then what's our second ask? Our second ask is this. Most of your current interventions require there to be an imminent threat. Someone has to be preparing. There's got to be an imminent threat. And the problem with that is all of these up to stage 5, you have that hate thing creep into the society and divide it, and you're really not doing anything. So it affects social cohesion in a big way. So our ask is stop, intervene when dehumanization happens, right? Because social cohesion means a lot to us as Australians, and we have to find ways of looking at the data and saying, it's not a lone pedestrian hate, but there's a lot of data to say there are groups here which use dehumanizing narratives, and all you have to do is knock the door and say, I'm keeping an eye on you. As simple as that. And so those are our two asks. And why are we doing this? Because the UN Special Rapporteur said that social media hate speech, acknowledged that it contributes directly to hate crimes against minorities, and called for this poisoning of minds online to be acknowledged and confronted. And we know, as we saw earlier, that this dehumanization, psychological research has shown that prejudice, stereotyping, and dehumanization just breaks people, right? It's got long-lasting adverse effects on the targets. And, so it's not something we can take lightly. And more importantly, though, I think we owe a better world to our children, right? So how can you help? Get in touch with us. We'd love to talk to you and see, how we can collaborate with each other, because we very passionately feel that this is something that we need to address now and here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Haroon Kasim, and thank you really for your insightful presentation and the experience which you have got a short time experience of 1.5 years, but I think your achievements are great. And I think that we can learn a lot from that as members of a civil society, how we can build harmony in the society by being activists in opposing this narrative of hate against various communities. Now, there are some questions popping up, but I think we'll take all the other questions towards the end of the webinar. Now, our third speaker was Rita Jibril, but unfortunately she's, Rita Jabri Markwell. She had a family emergency and she could not take part. So we'll go to our fourth speaker. Now, fourth speaker is Dr. Adil Khan, and I've known him for the last few months, and he's also a founder member of the Australian Indian Muslim Forum. Now, Adil is currently a fellow at the Melbourne Law School. Prior to this, he held prestigious Mackenzie postdoctoral fellowship, also at the Melbourne Law School. He received his PhD from Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies. He also has previously been a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute of Global Law and Policy at Harvard Law School and a visiting fellow at the Institute of Human Sciences in Vienna. He is one of the founding members, as I said, of Australia India Muslim Forum, a community-led study group for Indian Muslims dedicated to organizing academic and political discussions that aim at developing a more informed participation in progressive politics. His research, interest, and expertise cover the fields of international legal histories, Indo-Islamic tradition of law and ethics and human rights, and international law and development. And Dr. Adil Khan will be talking on comparing alternative frames of Islamophobic discourses. This short talk will try to compare the analytical and strategic, both in legal and political terms, risks and rewards of framing certain Islamophobic discourses, alternatively in terms of firstly as being offensive to religious sensitivities, or secondly as blasphemous speech acts, or thirdly as racist hate speech. This examination will extend to different forms of civic cohabitation and global solidarity these alternative framing enables. Thank you, Dr. Adil Khan. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. Good afternoon and adab to everyone. I would like to begin by acknowledging that I am speaking from the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. and to pay respects to the elders, families, past and present and emerging. I would also like to thank the organizers of this webinar, of the MEFF, and especially its trustee and our master of ceremonies, Zia Bhai, for this kind invitation to share some of my thoughts on and reflections with all of you today. So as Zia Bhai has already mentioned, the focus of my reflections is on comparing and contrasting the dangers and benefits of different framings of what exactly constitutes Islamophobic discourse and the responses it ought to elicit from us. The particular frames that I will be talking about are, as he has mentioned, blasphemous speech acts, offenses against religious sensitivities, and finally as racist speech. So now I'll look at these, each of these frames separately. So as a blasphemous speech act, so amongst certain reactionary Islamist groups, the framing of Islamophobic discourses as essentially being forms of transgressions against different purported religious commandments gets adopted. This is also often simply assumed to be the purported reaction and framing amongst most global Muslim communities in the media, in the political discourse and intellectual discourses reporting and commenting upon Muslim reactions to Islamophobic discourses. Thus, in this framing, the violation that an Islamophobic discourse commits is against a juridical commandment of Islamic law, something that is in itself a problematic category and is a modern reformulation of what constitutes Islamic law and how it operates. This framing enables a limited form of civic cohabitation and anemic global solidarity, one that focuses on defending Islam and its basic tenets, rather than, for instance, illuminating and reflecting upon the structures enabling Islamophobic discourses itself. So this I sort of refer to what Greg was saying earlier and also what Dr. Haroon was saying. So these structures, for example, colonialism and different forms of supremacist formations, they get elided instead of a focus on saying Islamic tenets have been violated. Now, our next framing is that of the Islamophobic discourses as offensive to religious sensitivities. Here, the offense gets framed in terms that the offense is purported to cause harm to religious sensitivities or the members of the concerned groups, in this case, Muslims, which in turn requires protection by the state in order to maintain public order. This framing is premised upon establishing a connection between the offending discourse and the potential violence by those so offended by the discourse. I want to urge some caution against this frame as well, and the kind of responses it calls forth, and relatedly, the kind of publics it helps create. Now, this is a narrow legalist framing, and I argue it calls forth an approach by courts of law and other state legal actors to balance security-based needs of maintaining public order against the demand of freedom of expression. So we've seen this in the Danish cartoons and what happened in France. The result invariably is that where if the offense civ discourse pertains to a majority religious community, be it Muslim or non-Muslim, the courts find in favor of regulating said speech acts on public order grounds. So this happens in jurisprudence after jurisprudence in different countries. And where, on the other hand, it involves a minority religious community, which is where Muslims are in most countries in the West, at least, courts find in favor of protecting the freedom of expression. For instance, this can be gleaned from the jurisprudence of the European Court of Human Rights over the last few decades. The result is that this proves largely ineffective as a mean of contesting Islamophobic discourses in Muslim minority contexts. And as troublingly, this is also the legal technique through which different forms of religious majoritarian formations or toxic nationalism, as Professor Greg was talking about, exercises their domination in different civic spaces. So you often hear about the sentiments of, let's say, in India, the Hindu sentiments are affected, and hence the court comes down on regulating certain speeches. and actually regulating freedom of speech, which is critical. Finally, by framing the underlying issue in terms of security versus freedom, this frame itself enables Islamophobic discursive tropes of violent Muslim fanaticism, quotes, pitted against Enlightenment ideal defending satirists who frame themselves as Voltaire, who are bravely engaged in criticizing religious beliefs. So these are both problematic sort of positions. So finally, there is the framing of Islamophobic discourse as a form of racist hate speech. And this is the frame I would urge us to adopt. Now, within this frame, I want to clarify that there exist two broad rival strands. One which can be referred to as a liberal one, and the other a more structuralist one. One of the lines of distinction between the two pertains, that is the liberal and the structuralist, pertain to the different understanding of racism that they espouse. With the liberal strand broadly conceiving racism in a limited sense of discrimination, while the structuralist stand espouses a more robust historico-structural definition of racism and its ill effects on people and communities. One that is crucially attentive to historically entrenched and unequal power relations amongst different groups in a given polity, as well as globally, as against a starting premise of some form of abstract equality. Here, I want to briefly reflect upon and hopefully dismantle what is often put as forward as an objection to this specific framing of Islamic discourse. Namely, in terms of how religious identity is categorically distinct from racial identity. Because, and it is claimed by the critics, that while race is an immutable, quotes, biological characteristic, religion is a matter of choice. This is the claim made. Thus, it is claimed that by these critics that one can change one's religion, but not one's skin color. This, I argue, and this is a position made by a lot of progressive liberals as well. Now, this, I argue, is premised both upon a problematic conception of how race, especially as relevant for the purposes of determining racism, is itself always socially constructed, and thus not some immutable biological category. That is, it is a product of social processes of racialization. Second, it is also premised upon a problematic liberal conception of religion as a choice of belief. Contrary to this, for a more accurate conception of religion, one must take two aspects of it into account. One, a negative one, namely that religion as identity is also very much socially ascribed and not merely a product of choice of free agents. And as we have especially seen with the rise of structures of global Islamophobia in the past few decades, this social interpellation of individuals into the Islamic religious identity is very much a process of racialization. Second, and in more positive terms, religion can be conceived as a tradition. And this illuminates how different religious traditions cultivate in their practitioners different capacities for actions, including educating them in the very capacity to choose between different courses of action. An understanding of religion that is broader than merely being a matter of belief, but rather one as being one of the means through which we foster ethical capacities. So we learn how to choose itself through the cultivation by religious traditions, which is a positive thing which we cannot just choose away. It would be paradoxical. Now, crucially, this framing of Islamophobia discourse as a form of hate speech, especially in its structuralist strand, in contrast to the above discussed frames, the previous ones, has the potential to put the focus on the concerned Speech Act and its authors itself and their radical extremist violence, as against, again, the above mentioned framing, where the potential violence considered is that of the intended victims of this discourse, who, because they feel bad by the discourse, become violent. So that is not the focus here. The focus is the violence of the act itself, the Speech Act, and what underlies it. This change focus also has a potential to actually scrutinize the enabling societal and global structures behind the authoring of such speech acts. Though this can also be framed in liberal terms, where one is purportedly dealing with individuals and choices, with certain bad apples, an approach which again elides the structuralist factors and forms which enable and promote such forms of speech acts. Again, Professor Barton's presentation covered this very well. Importantly, in a structural formulation of Islamophobic discourse as racist hate speech, which is what I'm calling for, it is structures of racist supremacy that get scrutinized as against demanding the exclusive scrutinization of the particular religious sensibilities offended or religious injunctions violated. Thus, reconceiving Islamophobia away from a focus on Islam and Islamic practices to being concerned with different forms of majoritarian and race supremacies. So that is the focus rather than showing what is the Islamic practice concern. Here, I would say that the global Black Lives Matters movement brings forth some of the vibrant forms of global solidarities such a framing enables, possibly enables. As well in countries such as UK, Australia, US, the models of civic cohabitation, it might inspire us towards. Many thanks for your time and attention, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Adil Khan, for framing your ideas very well. Now we are going to take some more questions and have a free discussion on that. There is a question from Najia. Some Muslims are also perpetrators of hate, right? Hate against non-Muslims and certain Muslim sects. So while looking at Islamophobia and hate groups from other side, can we also look toward within ourselves and within our communities that there are some discourses which happen among Muslims against other communities, generalizations, for example. Maybe I might point out against Jews, generalizing Jews, and there's some hate speech by Muslims on that. What do you think about that, and how do you encounter that? Who would be the best person to?
Can I answer that? Or,
yeah, sure.
Unless Haroon Bhai wants to go. No, I feel that's very significant, and that's why I feel there are two things. By framing Islamophobia or instrumentalizing Islamophobia or conceiving it in terms of the first two terms that I mentioned, especially as blasphemous speech acts, one allows a hijacking of or instrumentalization of Islamophobia in terms which actually gets used by who are basically Islamic reactionary groups. So there's one thing. So there's definitely that, there's no denying that happens. But I'm also looking at it analytically, what helps us clarify, and then of course, strategically, what is a good thing. And there also the framing of Islamophobia in terms of offensive to religious sensibilities is what I wanted to highlight there is it's better to understand this in terms of minority majority. So for instance, in a country like Egypt, where Muslims are in the majority, the same technique of saying Muslim sentiments are being hurt by something sort of Coptic Christians are doing, which could be critiquing or hate speech being perpetrated by Muslim majority, how the courts respond to that. If you frame it in terms of offense to religious sensitivities, the courts usually come down in the favor of the majority. This is there. So in the European Court of Human Rights, for instance, the court has come down on a public order grounds, on the grounds for let's say the Catholic Christians in Austria, but in the favor of Sunni Muslims in Turkey. So the point being, the problem is in its framing, and we've got to frame all these forms of hate speech as racist hate speech. So the focus has to be on who is the perpetrator and what is the structure lying behind it, rather than making it about the victim and their beliefs and or not. So I think that goes across. So anti-Semitism, same set of issues. Thank you.
If I can just add to that, I don't think you're saying any form of hate is right? So my concern is that there's a huge difference in the amount of awareness of different kinds of hate speech, right? For instance, recently, the federal government asked for submission on right-wing extremism in Australia. And there are about, I don't know, many Muslim organizations listed. There's not one Hindutva organization listed, right? It doesn't mean it's not here. It means there's a huge awareness gap. And by that awareness gap, what we do is we enable one kind of hate speech, and we go after certain kinds of hate speech, right? For instance, in this talk, Professor Barton talked about fascism and Hindutva, right? We know it exists in Australia, right? But yet over here, a fascist is a white Australian, and yet the Hindutva thing is still not in the picture yet, right? And so there's a huge gap in awareness, whether and I think in my mind, certainly the legal things do come in, but in my mind, if we don't know about it, we will not look into it. And I think that's where we are, where we have chosen not to look at certain forms of hate speech, and we're looking at other forms of hate speech, and sometimes even demonizing people of that community who are not involved in hate speech. And I think what all we're asking for is a more balanced approach where we're able to address all forms of hate speech, if that makes sense.
Thank you. There is another question, Dr. Haroon, from Neeraj. Do you think the combination of Hindutva with social media became the driving force of hate in India and Indian diaspora in different countries, including Australia?
Oh, I have no doubt in my mind that the social media has hugely amplified this hate narrative and the dehumanization narrative, because a lot of it is automated, right? So the answer to this is absolutely yes. And the question, of course, is what do we do about it? Because it is a real threat. And I think the first thing is to start recognizing that this is dehumanization, and that's driving social discord, and that needs to be addressed as an emergent issue. And that's the struggle that we're having, that there just doesn't seem to be urgency with which it needs to be addressed. And as activists, all we can do is banging our drums and saying, hear us out. This is destroying families, it's destroying people, right? Destroying our Australian multicultural values, and we need to act right now.
Thank you, Dr. Kasim. There is no other question there, but can I just ask a question myself? Now, we have seen recently the issues in Palestine and Israel. We have seen that the people who have been victims of Nazism, and now the Israelis, now they have constructed a narrative against the Palestinians. And as Dr. Haroon, you elaborated how people tend to form this concept narrative of the other. Now the Palestinians have now become the other, and as subhumans, where the Israelis can basically decimate them without counting their lives. Do you have any comment on that issue? You are muted.
Yeah. Look, I think it's sad, and I think to me, what is striking in this whole thing is this playbook, if I may call that, and probably not the appropriate word, has been very consistent from the Holocaust period, where you dehumanize and then exterminate people. And it's sad that the Palestinian people are going with that. Our hearts go out to them. We stand with them, and we would be very keen to find ways to work with them, because at the end of the day, the narrative is the same. It dehumanizes people, which it shouldn't be, and that is a violation of human rights and nothing else. And we one of our interests is reaching out to people across communities and saying, look, if we all are being affected by it, it's only important that we work together and get the government to recognize that this is a huge problem that needs to be addressed right now. I don't know if I've answered a question there.
No, I think that's good. I think that's that.
Can I come in on that as well, Ziya?
Sure. Go ahead.
Yeah, so that's actually very interesting, and we at inshallah at Australia India Muslim Forum will be having a event on that. So one thing that I wanted to bring forward and connecting it to what I was talking about, that what kind of solidarity one can espouse with Palestinian people. So one thing that, and again, what kind of hate gets visibilized and what kind of hate gets invisibilized. So this, I think, would be an interesting example. For instance, for a lot of global Muslims, when one of the striking events, some people who didn't even have an idea of what Palestine was or Israel was, still a lot of apolitical people, but it was brought to light by what happened at the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And then the narrative was of its attack on Islam, which and then hence you have a solidarity with the people of Palestine on that basis, which enables a form of solidarity, but also disables a form of solidarity. For instance, the multiple communities that form Palestine, including Jews and Christians. So a week before, Christians are celebrating Easter, were Palestinian Christians celebrating Easter were attacked by the police, which didn't become a big issue in a lot of parts of the world that we are from. And in a way, the understanding of Palestine as understanding of Israel and Zionism as a structural factor, not just as another religious community attacking a religious community, which is how, again, if we understand these issues in terms of religious sensitivities being offended, we lose out on that broader thing, that the focus is on Zionist as a supremacist ideology. That needs to be brought out. And then how can we have solidarity with people who are suffering from that supremacist ideology, who might be of a religious community, might be of a religion, but they are of a certain nation, which is sort of includes various religious communities.
Thank you very much. I think we may be concluding now. And I just want to thank all the speakers who have done the presentations, and also the speaker who could not make it because of her family issues. And it has been a very enlightening seminar, or rather webinar. And I think we had a diverse group of speakers from various skill base. And I think it has given us some ideas to us of how do we proceed. Now, I think that the emphasis should be that we as individuals, as members of the civic society, have a responsibility as well, apart from the governments and activists and lawyers and so on, that within our circle of family and friends, we have to ensure that we don't indulge in this hate speech against certain groups. And we basically contribute towards society in bringing about peace and harmony. And so we all individually and collectively have a role to play.
So, Ziya, if I can quickly, sorry to interrupt. I think there are two more questions by Nisha.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, they just came up. I didn't realize. Okay, let's take it up. So Nisha is basically asking Adil bhai, a question. Thanks for emphasizing the structural dimension of Islamophobia. Could you please elaborate on what solidarity means to you in this context? Can you just elaborate on, you're talking about solidarity. She wants some more further explanation. And I think the second question, I'll just read that as well so you can answer it together. Since Adil is talking about solidarity in the Palestinian context, perhaps he could next elaborate on solidarity in the Indian diaspora context as well. Adil bhai.
I mean, there's a lot there. Thank you for those questions. I think one point I want to, I will sort of elaborate here, is how does this sort of structuralist sort of formulation of Islamophobia as a structuralist form of racism differ from the solidarity which is based on the offense to religious affinities. So here, taking this frame, I feel allows us to not limit our solidarities to our own religious communities that one sort of ascribes to or is born into or is interpolated into. It becomes a much more, it's still a complicated, solidarity is always a complicated thing. It has its, there's no easy way of solidarity, but it does enable a more coherent and a more sort of humanistic form of solidarity, which is shared across. So there, it is hierarchy and inequality and sort of intolerance in all its forms, in all across the globe, that one can have solidarity to. So one has solidarity with the people of Palestine, one has solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement. Again, not to sort of again evacuate all of these movements and their struggles of their histories. But I think that aspect is very important. So your solidarity is not limited to your ethnic or religious kin or your national kin. It is a solidarity that is more universal, and I think that's a big difference between the two forms of solidarities they enable.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, and I think that example you gave was good. That while Muslims were infuriated on the attack on the Aqsa Mosque in Palestine, while we have no idea of that news that that Eastern Christian Easter time they were attacked as well. So I think we do all have this weakness that when it comes to my community or my faith community or my ethnic community or my racial community, we come up and we make a lot of hue and cry. But when it comes to others, we just keep silent about it. So I think that justice needs to be maintained. That even if some other communities are suffering, which are not members of my community, I think that justice demands that we should raise, as member of the global society, we should raise issues with that. And I think we have to be really take home that message that we need to maintain solidarity with humanity at large. Wherever there is injustice that was against whom, I think we should make our efforts to make sure the justice is restored to them. Since we do have some more time and questions are popping up, there's another question, is that instead of blaming others, how much we as Muslims are in terms of education and unity among Muslims that we are lacking? How do we manage to maintain solidarity among ourselves? I think the question might not be very clear there.
I mean, if I could sort of just
some idea from
reflect on, yeah. So I mean, that's where I would like to point to Zia Bhai and the kinds of efforts, and this sort of MEFF itself is an example of those efforts. Again, those efforts are especially for minority communities, be it Muslim, be it Hindu, be it whatever. Especially minority communities are in unequal power relations. There, it's harder to work on these efforts, but again, efforts are being made, and as such efforts, so how to respond to it is by participating in it. I think that is what we have to do.
I think we all need to become activists. I think that's what get off our bottoms and get on and be active in these things. Okay, I think that we had a pretty long session, and I think it was a very lively discussion. And thank you, Haroon Bhai and Adil Bhai and Professor Barton, and the fourth speaker. I hope that her daughter has a speedy recovery, and we pray for her. And thank you so much. And we hope that next year, we wish to invite you guys here in Sydney and enjoy with us with tens of thousands of people at our MEFF festival, and attend it, inshallah. And please make dua for us that festival goes on. Thank you so much. I think we'll just end it here.
Thank you so much, Zia bhai. Walaikum salam.
Thank you, Zia. Bye.